Hail the size of hen's eggs hammered the valley, and the Holloway place, new lumber, store-bought nails, a barn raised in 3 weeks, folded like wet paper. Yet across the draw, a homestead stitched from cast-off stood whole, its patchwork roof shedding ice, its mended fences humming in the wind. Strangers came afterward to ask the woman in the doorway one question: how? Before any of that, there was a wagon and a long road west. Adeline Mercer rode beside her husband Wendell, watching prairie unspool toward Nebraska. They had $11, 2 mules, and a deed to 40 acres nobody else had wanted. "We've got nothing to build with," Wendell said. Adeline studied a broken barrel rotting in a ditch. "Folks throw away more than they use. My grandmother always said a thing's only worthless to the eye that won't look twice." She filed that thought away like seed. The 40 acres sat in a shallow bowl of grassland north of the settlement of Quail Bend, and the first time Adeline walked it end to end, she understood why the parcel had gone begging. The previous claimant had given up before the second winter. A half-finished dugout sagged into the hillside. The well he'd started was a dry throat of crumbling clay. No fence, no barn, no proper tools. Only a rusted spade with a split handle and a coil of fence wire so bent it looked chewed. Wendell turned the spade over in his hands and frowned. He'd been a wheelwright's apprentice back in Ohio before the trade dried up, good with his hands but unaccustomed to making do with so little. "A man can't farm on hope and a broken shovel," he said. "Then we'll find the rest," Adeline answered. She had grown up the daughter of a tinker, a woman who'd taught her to see a use in everything. While Wendell fretted over the dugout, Adeline walked the wagon road that ran past their claim toward town. By noon, she'd found a wagon wheel with 3 good spokes, abandoned where an axle had snapped. By dusk, she'd dragged home 2 cracked barrels, a length of torn canvas stiff with old paint, and a coffee tin of bent nails some freighter had cursed and flung aside. Wendell watched her lay the haul out in the grass. "Scraps," he said. "Pieces," she corrected. "There's a difference between a thing that's finished and a thing that's only resting." Quail Bend itself was a single dusty street with a church, a smithy, and the mercantile owned by a broad, smiling man named Harlan Pruitt. Pruitt extended credit to new homesteaders the way a spider extends silk, and most families arrived owing him before they'd turned a single furrow. He sold lumber, tools, seed, and the promise that a proper farm could be bought whole, on time, at interest. The Mercers had no money for Pruitt's promises. That first week, Adeline noticed how the other newcomers looked at her salvage pile. The Holloways, especially, a young couple who'd bought everything new and gleaming on Pruitt's books, and who pitied the pair living out of a sagging dugout with a heap of other men's garbage. "They'll learn," Adeline told Wendell that night, banking the fire with care. "Or the weather will teach them. One or the other always does." Wendell didn't answer. He was looking at the wheel, beginning, despite himself, to see a shape in it. In late April, the spring rains came hard and brief, and the Mercers had nothing to catch the water in. By the time Wendell dug a trench, the runoff had already sheeted across their land and vanished into the draw, leaving the soil only damp on top and dust beneath. Adeline stood in the drizzle watching all that water flee, and something in her went taut. She thought of the cracked barrels, the torn canvas, the broken wheel. "We're losing the most valuable thing on this place," she said, "and we're losing it because we built nothing to hold it." That night she couldn't sleep. She sketched in the dirt by firelight. A barrel sunk below a canvas funnel, the wheel laid flat as a frame, the wire lashing it all together. Wendell crouched beside her, and for the first time since Ohio, she saw the old craftsman's gleam come into his eye. But wanting a thing and trusting it are 2 different animals, and Wendell had spent his life learning that proper work required proper materials. He sat back on his heels and rubbed the stubble on his jaw. "It's a clever notion, Addie, I'll grant you that. But a barrel that's cracked won't hold water any better than a sieve. Canvas rots. Bent nails split the wood when you drive them. We'd pour a month of labor into something that fails us the first hot week, and then where are we?" Behind, that's where. Further behind than if we'd done nothing. And if we do nothing, Adeline said, we're behind for certain. Pruitt would advance us a proper rain barrel, galvanized, two of them, even, and a coil of new wire and lumber for a catchment, on his terms. She let the words sit. They both knew families 3 years on his books who farmed all season and ended each fall owing more than they'd started with. We came west to own something, Wendell, not to rent our own sweat from a man behind a counter. He was quiet a long while. The fire popped. Out in the dark, the mules shifted and blew. I don't doubt your eye, he said at last. I doubt the pieces. There's a reason folks throw a cracked barrel out. They throw it out because they've got money to buy a new one. We don't. That changes what a thing is worth. She picked up a wedge of the broken barrel stave and turned it in the firelight. A crack isn't the end of a barrel. It's a barrel asking to be understood. Soak the wood and it swells. Caulk the seam with pine pitch and rendered tallow. Bind it with the wheel rim for a hoop. You're a wheelwright. You've tightened 100 loose joints. This is the same skill, only nobody's paying you to doubt it. That landed. She watched it land. He'd been a man with a trade, and the trade had left him, and somewhere on the road west he'd quietly decided his hands were good for ordinary labor and nothing finer. She was handing the finer part back to him. If it fails, he said slowly, we've lost time and tallow. And if it holds, we've lost nothing but other men's garbage, and we've gained a thing that's ours outright. He looked at the wheel, the barrels, the coil of chewed-looking wire. He looked at his wife. The drizzle had stopped, and somewhere a meadowlark tried out the first notes of a clear morning. Show me your drawing again, he said. They started at dawn and did not stop. Wendell pulled the cracked barrel apart stave by stave, soaked the wood in the creek until it swelled, and bound it with the iron rim he'd pried from the broken wheel. Adeline rendered tallow over the fire and mixed it with pine pitch scraped from fence-line cedars, working the warm paste into every seam. By the third day, they sank the mended barrel beneath a funnel of the painted canvas, stretched taut on a frame of wagon spokes and lashed with the straightened wire. It looked like nothing anyone in Quail Bend had ever bought. When the next rain came, they crouched in the dugout and listened. Water drummed on canvas, ran down the funnel, and began steadily to fill the barrel. The man who taught them most never lifted a tool on their behalf. He was old Euless Fonda, a freedman who kept bees and a tidy garden at the edge of Quail Bend, and who had homesteaded through 3 droughts before the Mercers were born. He stopped by their fence one morning, eyed the rain catcher, and laughed with pure delight. You two see straight, he said. Out here, the land don't give you much. But folks waste plenty. Wealth's just stuff that ain't been put in its right place yet. He tapped his temple. Patience builds what money can't. You remember that when it gets hard. And it will. The rain catcher changed everything, because it proved the method. Once Wendell saw water standing clear and cool in a barrel he'd resurrected from another man's failure, the doubt drained out of him and something better flowed in. Appetite. He began to walk the wagon roads himself now, eyes down, and he came home muttering plans. The salvage came in a steady tide once they learned where to look. The wagon road was a ribbon of other people's misfortune. A freighter's snapped axle here, a homesteader's abandoned load there, the slow erosion of everything hauled west by people who'd packed too heavy and lightened their wagons by the mile. Behind the smithy, Adeline found a midden of bent iron the blacksmith was glad to be rid of. At the edge of the settlement where the church had replaced its roof, a heap of weathered shingles lay waits for someone with the patience to sort the sound from the ruined. They built a system, and the system had a logic that pleased them both. Anything that could hold a shape became structure. Anything that could hold water became storage. Anything too far gone for either fuel or fill. Adeline kept the inventory in her head and later in a ledger made of butcher paper, so many staves, so many feet of wire, so many usable shingles. And Wendell turned the inventory into objects. The animal pens came next. They had no animals yet to speak of. Only the 2 mules and a clutch of hens Adeline had bought cheap, because the seller swore they'd quit laying. They hadn't quit. They'd only been frightened off the nest by a weasel, and a tighter coop fixed that within a week. Their first small vindication, eggs warm in her apron by Sunday. Wendell wove a fence from the bent wire, threading it through posts cut from the cedars, and where the wire ran short, he filled the gaps with woven willow, the way he'd seen basket makers do. The pen wandered a little. It wasn't pretty, but a fox tested it twice and gave up, and that was the only verdict that mattered. For the hens, he built a coop from the church's cast-off shingles, double-walled with the dead air between for warmth, roofed with a single intact sheet of the painted canvas weighted with stones. The hens approved. They moved in and resumed laying with an enthusiasm that suggested they'd never meant to stop. The seed dryer was Adeline's particular pride. She'd watched her grandmother dry herbs on screens in a warm draft, and she wanted the same for the squash and bean seed they'd need for next year's planting and for the herbs she could sell or trade. From the broken wheel's surviving spokes and a frame of scrap lath, she built a series of shallow trays, their bottoms woven from the inner bark of basswood, split fine. She stacked the trays in the dugout's warmest corner, where the cook fire's heat rose and pooled, and the moving air did the rest. Seed that would have molded in a damp sack dried hard and bright, and she sorted it into the cleaned, caulked halves of the second cracked barrel, each variety in its own dry vault. Word traveled, as it does in thin country where there's little else to talk about. The Holloways rode past one afternoon on their way back from Pruitt's, the wagon loaded with new lumber and a gleaming galvanized trough, and they slowed to look at the Mercer place with expressions that hovered between amusement and unease. "You've built yourself quite a," the young Holloway husband searched for the word, "collection." "We've built a farm," Adeline said pleasantly. "Slower than yours, I'll grant, but we don't owe it to anybody." He laughed, not unkindly, the way a man laughs at a child's sandcastle. "Pruitt says a farm built right is built once. All this patching, you'll spend more time mending than growing. Maybe," Adeline wiped her hands on her apron, "or maybe a thing you've mended yourself you know down to the grain, and a thing you've bought whole you don't know at all until it breaks." The Holloways rode on. Wendell came up beside her, watching the dust settle behind their wagon. "He's not entirely wrong," he admitted. "We do spend a great deal of time mending. We spend it once and learn the place," she said. "He'll spend it all season and learn the inside of Pruitt's ledger." She turned back toward the dugout, where the seed trays breathed their faint, sweet smell of drying squash. "Besides, Euless told me something. The land won't give us much out here, so we take what's already been given and thrown away. There's a fortune lying in ditches if you've the patience to gather it." Through May and into June, the scrap farm grew the way coral grows, imperceptibly day to day, astonishingly over weeks. The dugout itself improved. Wendell shored its sagging roof with salvaged lath and a lattice of cedar, then faced the front with sorted shingles until the hillside hovel began to resemble an actual house. Adeline chinked the gaps with a mortar of clay, straw, and the everlasting tallow until no draft found its way in. But the work that would matter most, though they didn't yet know it, was the windbreak. The bowl of land that be more worthless to others, open on the western side to the long unbroken run of the prairie, was where the wind came from, and the wind out here was not an occasional visitor, but a permanent resident with opinions. It flattened the grass, dried the soil, and stripped the moisture from anything that dared grow tall. The Holloways, on higher and supposedly better ground, had the same problem and answered it with a fence of new milled lumber. Board butted against board, a handsome solid wall. "That'll catch the wind like a sail," Wendell observed when they passed it. "A solid wall doesn't stop wind. It just gives the wind something to shove." He knew this from wheels, oddly enough, from the way a turning thing met the air, from the way force found the weak point and concentrated there. A wall that refused the wind entirely would, in a hard blow, become a lever working against its own posts. So the Mercers built something else. Along their western line they set posts of cedar, and between them they did not build a wall but a weave, a permeable hedge of every long, flexible thing they'd gathered. Willow withes, split lath, the torn canvas cut into strips and woven through, old fence wire strung in courses and threaded with brush. The result let perhaps a third of the wind pass through, slowed and broken into harmless eddies, while the rest was lifted and scattered. "It looks like a beggar's quilt," Wendell said, standing back from it. "It looks like it'll bend instead of break," Adeline answered. She'd watched cattails do the same in a storm, bowing flat and springing back while rigid reeds snapped. "My grandmother had a saying, 'The willow outlives the oak in a wind,' because the willow knows how to lose gracefully." They planted in the windbreak's shelter, and the difference was visible within a fortnight. The sheltered rows stood greener and taller than the exposed ground beyond, the soil holding its moisture where the broken wind couldn't steal it. Euless Fonda came again, this time bringing a swarm of bees he'd caught and didn't need, housed in a hive he'd built from. What else? A salvaged barrel and some scrapboard. "Figured they'd suit your operation," he said dryly. "Second-hand bees for a second-hand farm." He showed Adeline how to keep them, and the bees took to the windbreak's flowering willow and the squash blossoms in these sheltered rows. And by midsummer there was honey, and honey was money in Quail Bend. It was honey, in fact, that first put real coins in Adeline's apron, traded at the church social where the women clustered around her jars and asked, a little shyly, how a family with nothing had managed bees. She told them plainly. Some laughed. One or two listened hard. The work was not romantic. It was endless, and it was humble, and Adeline's hands cracked at the knuckles from tallow and clay and cold creek water. There were failures, a first seed tray that warped and spilled, a stretch of windbreak that sagged until Wendell learned to set the posts deeper, a barrel whose seam wept until they'd caulked it 3 times. Each failure taught the next attempt. That was the secret nobody who bought their farm whole would ever learn. A thing built from understanding can be understood when it goes wrong, and mended and made better. A thing bought whole was a mystery until the day it failed, and then it was only a loss. By the first week of July, the Mercer place, small but complete. 2 rain catchers fed a sunken cistern lined with clay. A fox-proof pen held a pair of pigs bought with honey money. The hens thrived. The seed barrel was filling. The windbreak stood green and humming with bees, and the garden behind it was the envy of anyone honest enough to admit envy. Wendell stood in the dooryard one evening and looked at all of it, every piece of it salvaged, mended, understood, and he laughed out loud, a sound Adeline hadn't heard from him since Ohio. "We built a farm," he said wonderingly, "out of what other men threw away." "We're not finished," she said, but she was smiling too. The triumph had a witness, and not a friendly one. Harlan Pruitt rode out himself in early July, ostensibly to welcome the new family, in truth to assess why one homestead in his territory owed him nothing. He sat his horse and surveyed the scrap farm with a merchant's narrow arithmetic. He saw a family thriving without his credit, and worse, he saw the church women who'd bought Adeline's honey, beginning to wonder aloud whether they needed quite so much from his shelves. "Resourceful," he said, and the word came out cold, "though I wonder how your patchwork holds up when real weather comes. Storm season's not far off." He touched his hat. "My door's open when you need proper materials." He rode away. Adeline watched him go, and her stomach tightened. Pruitt did not make threats. Men like Pruitt rarely needed to. He made arrangements, and the arrangements did the threatening for him. The first sign was the freight road. For weeks, the Mercers had gathered salvage freely from the public wayside and from the blacksmith's discard heap, and no one had minded, because no one had imagined the garbage was worth minding. But in mid-July, the blacksmith, a decent enough man named Garrity, but one who owed Pruitt for his forge coal and his winter flour, told Adeline, not meeting her eyes, that he'd been advised to sell his scrap iron rather than give it away. Pruitt, it turned out, had offered to buy the smithy's entire discard pile at a standing rate. "It's only business," Garrity mumbled. "He's paying good money for junk. I can't rightly turn it down." "No," Adeline said evenly. "I don't suppose you can. It was a clever move," and she recognized its cleverness even as it stung. Pruitt had found the seam in her operation, her dependence on free cast-offs, and was caulking it, shut with his own money. He could afford to buy up every scrap heap in the county and let it rust in a barn forever, simply to deny it to a family that had embarrassed his ledger by not needing it. Within 2 weeks, the easy salvage had dried up. The church's old shingles, the freight road cast-offs that other homesteaders might have let lie. Word had gone round that Pruitt would pay coin for such things, and so suddenly everything had a price. And the price was set by the one man who wanted the Mercers to fail. "We could pay it," Wendell said one night, doing sums on the butcher paper ledger. "We've honey money. We could buy scrap like everyone else now, and feed the very man who's trying to starve us." Adeline shook her head. "No, we change what we gather. He's bought up the iron and the shingles. He hasn't bought the willow on the creek banks. He hasn't bought the cattails in the slough or the basswood bark or the clay in the cut bank. He can corner a market in other men's garbage. He can't corner the whole living earth." It was brave talk, and half of it was true, but the squeeze was real. Without the steady iron and milled scrap, the bigger projects slowed. The second cistern went unlined. A planned smokehouse stalled for want of nails. The Mercers were not beaten, but they were pressed, and pressed harder when the second arrangement revealed itself. Pruitt held the note on the Holloway place, as he held notes on half the valley. And the Holloways, struggling under the weight of everything they'd bought new and on time, had begun to grumble that it wasn't fair, that the Mercers were getting something for nothing, gathering free what honest families paid for. Pruitt encouraged the grievance. He was good at encouraging grievances. Soon there was muttering in Quail Bend that the Mercers were little better than scavengers, that they lowered the tone of a respectable settlement, that a family living in a dugout patched with church garbage was not the sort of neighbor a growing community wanted. The muttering had a practical edge. There was talk of a petition, that the settlement might formally discourage salvage operations on the public road, might even ask the new claim office to look hard at whether the Mercers had truly improved their land per the homestead requirements or had merely cluttered it. This last was the sharpest fear, and Adeline lay awake over it. The homestead law required genuine improvement, a real dwelling, real cultivation, as the price of final title to the land. If Pruitt could persuade the right official that a dugout faced with second-hand shingles and a garden behind a beggar's quilt fence did not constitute proper improvement, the Mercers could lose the 40 acres entirely, scraps and bees and all. "He can't do that," Wendell said. "We've improved this land more than any place in the valley." "He doesn't have to prove we haven't," Adeline said quietly. "He only has to make us look like what he's already told everyone we are. Junk people on a junk farm." She stared at the dark ceiling. "We've built everything out in the open where it can be seen. Now I'm afraid of who's looking." The pressure found its way into the house, the way pressure does, settling into the spaces between two tired people. It was not a quarrel, exactly. Wendell had begun to feel the weight of the settlement's opinion in a way Adeline had not expected. He was a craftsman by temperament, a man who wanted his work respected and to hear it called clutter and junk by the very neighbors whose cast-offs had built it. That wore on him. "Maybe we took it too far," he said one evening, not looking at her. "The pens, the weave fence, the trays. Maybe if we'd built one proper thing, bought a little lumber, made one part of this place look like a real farm instead of a magpie's nest, they would have such an easy time pointing." "You don't believe that." "I believe I'm tired of being laughed at." The admission cost him. "Back in Ohio, I made wheels that carried families 1,000 miles. Folks respected that work. Out here I weave fences out of willow and patch barrels with tallow, and the whole valley thinks I'm a fool playing in a trash heap." Adeline set down her mending. She understood then that Pruitt's real weapon had never been the scryen or the petition. It was shame. He had found a way to make them ashamed of the very ingenuity that had freed them from him, and shame, applied steadily, could accomplish what no threat could. "Euless told me something the first week," she said. "He said wealth is only stuff that hasn't been put in its right place yet. I thought he meant the salvage, but I think he meant us, too. We were a wheelwright with no wheels to build, and a tinker's daughter with no tin. We were thrown away, Wendell, same as the rest of it, and we put ourselves in our right place." He said nothing, but he didn't argue. The next morning brought the official, the claim agent for the district, a thin, careful man named Bickford, with ink-stained fingers and a leather casing of forms, rode out to inspect the Mercer homestead, and he did not come alone. Pruitt rode with him, all hospitality, having apparently offered to show the agent around the valley's claims. The Holloways trailed behind, curious, and behind them a scattering of settlement folk who'd heard the agent was making rounds and wanted to see how it fell out. Adeline understood the staging at once. Pruitt had arranged for the Mercers to be judged in front of an audience by an official he'd spent the ride flittering, with the settlement's prejudice already poured into the man's ear. Bickford dismounted and surveyed the place with a frown, and Pruitt began the narration before anyone asked. "You'll see what I mean, Agent," he said smoothly. "Now the law's particular about genuine improvement, real dwelling, real cultivation. What we've got here," he gestured grandly at the shingled dugout, the woven pen, the beggar's quilt windbreak, "is a great deal of, accumulated material. Hard to say it rises to the standard of a permanent bona fide homestead. More of a encampment, you might say. A clutter." A few of the settlement folk murmured agreement. The Holloways looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Bickford took out a form and a pencil. "I'm obliged to note the condition of improvements," he said neutrally. "Dwelling, water, cultivation, permanence." He looked at the patched dugout with visible skepticism. "Mr. Pruitt does raise a fair question about permanence. This all looks rather provisional." Adeline felt the ground tilt. Everything they'd built, all the ingenuity, was about to be reframed as exactly what Pruitt had labeled it: temporary junk, an encampment, not a home. The very flexibility that made their farm strong was being turned into evidence that it wasn't real. She opened her mouth to defend it and saw, in Bickford's already doubtful face, that defense was useless. Pruitt had set the frame. Arguing inside it would only confirm it. The harder she insisted the dugout was a real house, the more she'd sound like a woman protesting too much over a hole in a hillside. Wendell's jaw was tight. The settlement folk waited. Pruitt wore the patient, kindly smile of a man watching a trap close exactly as he'd built it. And then, far off to the west, the prairie light went strange, a green bruised darkness climbing the sky. The storm came faster than any of them had ever seen one move. The strange green light swallowed the sun, and the air went heavy and still in the way that empties a person's stomach with old animal knowing. Then the wind arrived, not a gust, but a wall of it, and behind the wind came the hail. The inspection scattered. Pruitt, Bickford, the Holloways, the settlement folk. All of them broke for shelter, for wagons, for anywhere. The Holloways made a desperate run for their own place over the rise, and the rest followed, scattering across the prairie as the first hailstones struck like flung gravel. Adeline and Wendell dove into the shingled dugout and pulled the salvage door shut behind them, and the world outside dissolved into a roar of ice and ruin. They crouched in the dark while the storm tried to tear the hillside open. Hail hammered the canvas and shingle roof in a deafening cannonade, and the wind screamed across the bowl of their land. And Adeline pressed her hands over her ears and waited for the roof to peel away, and the rain catchers to shatter, and the windbreak to flatten, and the whole patient year of salvage to be returned to garbage in a single hour. This was the verdict, she thought. This was the weather come to teach what she'd once smugly said it would. All her brave talk about willows and oaks, about bending instead of breaking. Now the wind would test it, and if the scrap farm failed, Pruitt wouldn't even need his petition. The storm would prove his case for him. An encampment swept away, a clutter scattered. They'd be exactly what he'd called them, with the whole valley as witness. "The roof's holding," Wendell said into her ear, barely audible. He had his hand flat against the shored lattice overhead, feeling it. "It's flexing. Listen. It's giving with the wind, not fighting it, like you said." She lowered her hands and listened past her own fear. The dugout groaned and shifted and held. The double-walled coop she could hear through the earthen wall, rattling but standing. And the wind itself, the wind that should have been a solid battering ram against them, came through broken and confused, its force scattered before it ever reached the house. "The windbreak," she whispered. "It's working!" Wendell found her hand in the dark. When the hail stopped, the silence rang. They pushed open the door into a transformed world. The air washed clean, the grass beaten flat, hailstones melting in white drifts, and there stood their farm. The patchwork roof had shed the ice. The rain catchers, sunk low and braced, had filled to the brim instead of toppling. The woven windbreak stood ragged but whole, every flexible piece of it bent and sprung back. The pens held, the cistern brimmed. Adeline turned slowly west, toward the rise where the Holloway place stood, toward where the others had fled. "Wendell," she said, "everyone ran the other way. We need to go see." They went on foot because the storm had spooked the mules, climbing the rise through drifts of melting hail toward the higher ground that everyone in Quail Bend had agreed was the better land. And from the top of the rise, the whole truth of the day laid itself out below them. The Holloway place was destroyed. The handsome new barn, raised fast on store-bought lumber and store-bought nails, had folded in on itself. The solid walls that caught the wind like a sail had been levered, off their footings and collapsed. The board windbreak fence, that fine rigid wall, lay flat in long sections, snapped at the posts exactly as Wendell had predicted, having given the wind something to shove against until the posts surrendered. The gleaming galvanized trough had been picked up and flung into a fence line. The new milled house still stood, but its roof was half gone, the fast-nailed shingles peeled away in sheets. And scattered across that higher ground were the people, the Holloways, Bickford the agent, Pruitt, the settlement folk, all of them who had fled toward the proper farms and found those farms coming down around them. They were unhurt, everyone, sheltered now in the wreckage and the lee of fallen walls, soaked and shaken and staring at the ruin of everything that money had bought whole. The young Holloway wife was weeping over the collapsed barn. Her husband stood in the rubble of his investment with the particular blankness of a man, watching a year of debt become a pile of broken lumber he still owed Pruitt for. Adeline and Wendell came down the rise toward them, and the settlement folk turned and watched them come. This couple from the junk farm, the scavengers, the encampment people, walking dry and steady out of a storm that had broken everyone else. What happened next, Adeline would remember for the rest of her life as the moment the year turned. She did not gloat. She had every right to, and she did not. She walked into the wreckage of the Holloway place, and she started to help. "The well house is sound," she called out, practical as ever. "Get the children in there out of the wet. Mr. Holloway, that roof beam. If we prop it with that fallen post, we can keep the rest of the roof from going." And she set her hands to the work of saving what could be saved on a farm that had nothing to do with her. Wendell was already lashing a temporary brace with wire he'd pulled, from habit, from his own coat pocket. Euless Fonda arrived at a limping run from his own place, which, the Mercers would learn, had come through fine, sheltered behind decades of patient hedging. And the three of them organized the dazed survivors into the work of mending. It was Bickford, the claim agent, who said it first, quietly, standing in the Holloway ruin with his soaked leather case still clutched under his arm. He was looking back across the rise toward the Mercer place, which stood plainly visible in the washed light. Small, patched, complete, and entirely intact. "That dugout of yours," he said to Adeline, "it held. It held because it could bend," she said. "We built every piece of it to give a little. A thing that won't give at all is a thing that breaks." She nodded at the collapsed barn. "That was built to stand against the wind. Ours was built to live with it. Out here, I've come to think living with the weather lasts longer than standing against it." Bickford was quiet a moment. Then he took out his form and his pencil, and Adeline braced for the worst. But the agent had eyes, and the agent had just watched the entire valley's worth of proper construction come apart, while a homestead built from salvage stood whole. He was not a fool, and he was, beneath the inkstains, an honest man who had been very nearly talked into a false judgment by a smooth-tongued merchant. "Mr. Pruitt," Bickford said, "asked me to judge whether your homestead constitutes genuine, permanent improvement of the land." He looked from the wreckage to the standing farm and back. "I find that it does. Emphatically. I find, in fact, that yours may be the only structure in this valley I'd call genuinely permanent, since it's the only one still standing." He began to write. Water catchment, sound and full. Cultivation, sheltered and thriving. Dwelling, weatherproof and demonstrably so. Permanence, he glanced up. Proven before witnesses by the worst storm I've seen in 20 years. I'll be recommending your patent for final approval. The settlement folk heard it. All of them heard it. And the thing about a crowd's opinion is that it bends too when the wind shifts hard enough. The same people who'd muttered about scavengers and clutter now stood in the ruin of the proper farms and looked at the junk farm on the hill with entirely new eyes. Pruitt tried to speak. He gathered his smooth merchant smile and began some remark about how unusual storms proved nothing, how a sensible person rebuilt properly with quality materials. But the words found no purchase. He was standing in the collapse of everything he'd sold, surrounded by people who owed him money for lumber now lying broken in the mud, and his counsel had abruptly lost its authority. The arithmetic had reversed on him. Every ruined farm in the valley was a debt he might never collect, and the one solvent, standing homestead was the one he'd tried hardest to break. He left quietly. There was nothing else for him to do. In the weeks that followed, the valley rebuilt, but it rebuilt differently. The Holloways came to the Mercers humbled and asked plainly to be taught. How did the windbreak work, that it bent instead of breaking? How did you sink a rain catcher so it filled instead of flying? How do you mend a cracked barrel so it holds? And Adeline and Wendell taught them. They taught the whole settlement freely, the way Euless had taught them. Wendell, the wheelwright nobody had needed, became the man the valley came to for how a thing should be built to live with the weather. Families began walking the freight roads with their eyes down, gathering. Pruitt's grip on the valley loosened, season by season, as more homesteads learned they could build from understanding instead of debt. The land, it turned out, gave more than it first appeared. You only had to know how to gather what had already been thrown away and where to put it. A year later, hail came again, smaller, briefer, but enough to send the valley to its shelters. This time no one ran the wrong way. The homesteads of Quail Bend, hedged now with woven windbreaks and braced with flexible joints, bent under the wind and sprang back whole. Adeline stood in her dooryard afterward, a real dooryard now before a real house grown out from the dugout, every board of it understood down to the grain. The rain catchers brimmed, the bees worked the willow, and across the draw, where strangers had once come to ask how a scrap farm survived, neighbors now came simply to learn. Wendell came to stand beside her, his craftsman's hands quiet at last. "A thing's only worthless," she said, "to the eye that won't look twice."